All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Scrum at Scale webinar presentation. My name is Alyssa Layden, and I'm the product owner of marketing for Scrum at Scale LLC. Before introducing today's speaker, I'd like to briefly cover just a few housekeeping items. First, to provide you with the best listening experience, all audio lines except for the host and the presenter will be muted during the webinar. If you would like to ask the presenter a question for the Q&A section or add a comment, please use the Q&A panel on your console. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be available to play on demand from both the Scrum at Scale website and the Scrum at Scale YouTube channel within 24 hours. We will also send a follow-up email that includes a link to the presentation slides used. All right, we are now ready to start today's presentation. And for that, I would like to introduce Jon Spruce, one of our certified Scrum at Scale trainers. Jon will lead a 30-minute presentation and then host a 15-minute Q&A session. All right, take it away, Jon.
Thank you. I'm assuming you can all see me on my screen for now. I'll be sharing a presentation shortly and take you through everything. So just give me 2 seconds. I'll get that up now. Okay. So as Alyssa mentioned there, I'm a Scrum at Scale trainer, certified, delivering training through the UK and Europe. I'm also a partner at a firm called Agile Centre, and the work that we're doing today is going to be primarily around the executive action team, which is one of the things I find most interesting around the Scrum at Scale framework. And we'll talk a little bit about how they're enablers for business agility and how they can help remove the big impediments that are inside an organization. Here's a little bit about me. I'm an enterprise coach and trainer. I have a whole raft of different certifications there from Scrum Alliance and Scrum at Scale. I've worked with lots of different large organizations in different guises, from coach and Scrum Master.
Hey, Jon, sorry to interrupt, but at least when we're seeing the screen, it's black on our side.
Let me see if I can find why that's happening. Just give me 2 seconds. Yeah, I can see my other face with a smaller beard. Probably see that there. Are we in?
Yep, that's perfect.
Thank you so much, Alyssa, and apologies to everybody who's dialed in and watching me faff around with technical problems. All right, cool. I'll come back into this. We should have time to make up no problems. So, where was I? So I've worked with lots of large organizations, as you can see on the screen there, mainly large banks within the enterprise coaching space. I've also worked as an executive producer, delivering product within Nike, Beats by Dre, those kind of clients. And worked in the UK government as well. So I've worked in lots of complex and complicated environments, and there's lots of different things in there which I've learned along the way from different scaling frameworks. And when I picked up the Scrum at Scale side of things, I realized that there was some interesting nuances to it and interesting parts of the framework that really sort of helped. One of those things was the executive action team. And so I've chosen today's webinar to be about that and primarily talk around some of my experience of using Scrum at Scale within a transformation program rather than delivery program. So it's quite an interesting sort of different approach to it. And what we're looking at here is how we've used that, the practices and the patterns within Scrum at Scale to execute and remove impediments from the organizational transformation that we did. So let's carry on. So Alyssa's already gone through this. The slides will be available. The webinar is recorded and possibly edited to get rid of the beginning part. And there'll be a survey as well, but the survey comes out, I think it's quarterly. So look out for that when they come through. The surveys are for the series of webinars rather than individual ones, but do take note. If you want to get in touch with me directly, I will be putting contact details at the end of this, so you can reach out direct if needed. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today. So why do we need an EAT? An EAT is the acronym for the Executive Action Team, which is a core part of the framework. What is the EAT's purpose? What do they do? Who should be on it as well? We'll talk a little bit about that and some of the experiences we've had so far as well. How regularly do they meet? What do those meetings look like? And what do they do in those meetings? We'll talk a little bit through that as well. And how do you get started? What I'm going to do is knit through each one of these agenda items, some of the core stuff from the training, but also some of the stuff that I've I've worked through as part of the day-to-day when we've been implementing this in an organization. So without further ado, I'll move on. So why do we need an executive action team? So one of the things that we've often found within transformation, as well as in product delivery, is that systemic impediments within the organization are often not able to be addressed by Scrum teams at the team level, also by Scrum Masters at the team level. There seems to be a will and a hunger to get these things changed, but they often hit an upper barrier. There seems to be a systemic issue in an organization which they can't get through. There's a policy change that's needed, or there's something that needs to be written off and signed for. There needs to be some money spent. There needs to be a HR policy update. And so without those people available to do these changes, as part of the executive action team, we often find that there's the impediments an organization tend to stall. They can't get done. It becomes a permafrost above the teams that they can't get that fixed. So why do we need them? The executive action team's role really is to remove those impediments systemically from the organization. They act like a Scrum team in their own right. And so they've got to be cross-functional, and we need them in there to help us move those impediments that can't be done anywhere else in the organization. So I was working with a large UK bank. They've got over 30 million customers in the UK. It's a group. They have over 75,000 employees, and the group's got about 2,000 branches across the UK. They've got 11 million online banking users, and they have 6.5 million active mobile users. So within this particular case study, if you like, we were looking at actually running a transformation program, primarily focusing in on engineering transformation, including adoption of Agile and adoption of DevOps practices throughout. So we're working with a very large organization, which is very old as well, a couple of 100 years old, with lots of legacy systems and lots of archaic end-of-life systems. We've got everything from mainframes built on COBOL from 35 years ago through to modern stacks, which are in the cloud and built in a very responsive manner with modern languages. So we had this whole mixed bag of different things, and we were looking at how we can help the organization move into a different direction. So the transformation itself was planned over 3 years. It's a very large transformation in the scale of it. The Agile ways of working, DevOps and automation, ultimately was to become the bank of the future. And this program that we were involved in allowed us to help with that. But we weren't building product, we were enabling the organization to move forward. So what we're planning to do is use some kind of framework to enable us to help adjust transformation at scale. So rather than looking at developing product at scale, we were looking at transformation at scale. So lots of teams, lots of labs, lots of locations, and how do we help sort of scale that out, really? The structure of the program, although it wasn't formally called Scrum at Scale at the time, the transformation was evolved into a very similar structure. So we had a program leadership team and a program community of practice with value streams across the organization we were working with. And each one of those had a transformation team leads, and we had some feature teams we were working with. And we actually ran it using Scrum, really. So our transformation stories would be planned every 2 weeks. They would be things like incorporating a new DevOps pipeline or building out a test-driven development framework with the actual teams on the ground and training them and educating them and helping them unblock those things. We met regularly across the value streams, and then we kind of then met regularly on top of that to ensure that the program team were very aware of it. On the right-hand side of the screen there, what you can see is that I've kind of looked at how our structure when we were running the program really aligned quite well with what Scrum at Scale looks like. The program leadership team, in effect, was an executive action team. They were very senior players within the bank. They were CIO, there was head of DevOps, head of software engineering, those type of very senior roles within the organization, so they could get stuff done. They had a program community of practice, and that's in effect a central Agile practice that we saw within that. And so the Agile Center of practice there was there to support that leadership team, to help move things forward, consultants, leadership, etc. Well, these value streams all met regularly as Scrum of Scrums. We would call that group of teams there. We had release planning and reviews and retros, etc., across the program to try and move the overall thing forward. Now, the Scrum of Scrums at the bottom of the teams there, multiple featured teams all working together, and they're doing their daily stand-ups, and they're also doing their scaled daily scrums together. They would also meet and regularly sort of review their work and retro as well. The program leadership team is the piece I wanted to talk about today, which is we had a group of senior leaders in there who managed to get stuff done. And I wanted to take you through a couple of different examples of how that works, really. So we were in the process of implementing a virtualization service within the organization. So how can you virtualize a mainframe on a local developer's laptop, rather than them having to access very expensive service hardware and potentially breaking a development environment for many other developers. So this had a huge net gain of efficiency for the teams when they would be able to work on it locally and play with it locally, destroy it if they need to, and then pull another copy down to their laptop. Virtualization is in effect allowing you to run something, a whole environment, literally inside your laptop itself without having to have external access to that environment. So what we would have is a central view of what that environment could look like, which is stable, and the developers could download it to their laptops and work on it and break it and work on it and iterate and work with it so that they understood that their code would work before they checked it into the overall repository. The only issue that we found is that when we demonstrated on our shiny Apple Macs, is that it worked. It worked beautifully. We had Docker, which is one of the name of these virtualization tools, running, and we had this instance inside it running as well, and we could actually spin up an environment within minutes rather than hours, and it was safe. So it meant that we could actually not get damaged by anything working outside of it. We had it contained within that laptop. When we came to then demonstrate a proof of concept on the client's laptop, we hit a problem. There was a virtualization setting within the BIOS that basically wouldn't allow virtualization within the laptops. What that basically meant was that there was a policy in place that wouldn't allow this to happen. It was some security policy that had been set up a long time ago. And so because they couldn't get that changed, in effect, this amazing kind of piece of kit, which was approved to be used within the organization, was not able to be used because a policy said no. The ServiceNow ticket wouldn't allow anybody to actually authorize it because it was just a policy. So we raised this out at a team level and then brought it up to the next level and had a chat there, and we brought it up again as an impediment to this particularly massively beneficial piece of kit. Eventually we managed to get to the executive action team, albeit the program leadership team, and had a chat to the CIO there. We explained what the issue was about this virtualization is a BIOS setting for the laptop and why it's not allowing us to get it in. And he said, well, that's my policy. I'm a CIO. I can make changes to policy if needed. And so he did. He executed a change of the policy, which allowed us to at least experiment with a small subset of the team. So he didn't just unblock the policy across the entire organization, but allowed for experimentation within that team. So a quick sign of a piece of paperwork and a quick email send. And we were able to do that and demonstrate the proof of concept within one of the feature teams on the screen. And once that's been demonstrated and proved to be safe within the security side of things, we were allowed then to scale it out across the organization. So people could raise a ticket for it. It would require authorization to enable the virtualization, but we'd managed to do something that wasn't able to be done before, and that was by using one of the empowered leaders in the organization to remove this huge systemic issue, this blocker that was just a policy. Now, the teams could have been doing this for months and then hit this blocker and never been able to change it. And also teams may not have had access directly to this senior leadership who may be able to get rid of this impediment, this key blocker. And so one of the things that we recognize is that by having that empowered leadership, by having them available to make sure that these things can be changed, it made a huge difference. The impact really is that we had a lot more visibility, both inside and out the bank. We had a lot more feedback on the program, and there was a very clear line of sight to the leadership. The executive team were massively engaged with all the impediments, but also with the success stories, because they're engaged all the time around what the work was being done and how it was getting demonstrated. They had a clear line of sight of that and would celebrate success as well as remove impediments. The value streams they had were much wider impact to the wider community, and the feature teams felt empowered and proud, because ultimately they were sharing their stuff outside of the bank. On social media, we recognized it. We did these huge show and tells across the organization for the transformation program itself. They became almost mini conferences in their own right, with the leadership and the executive action team front and center to help sort of demonstrate that they are listening and they're in the place. So it's really interesting. And what we found is that people were actually posting online as well. I can containerize in mainframes applications and run regression tests on code in a virtual mainframe runtime. So it's another amazing event by the organization. And so it was really interesting, because the way that we did this was breaking down barriers to that very senior leadership. And that was quite a scary thing for quite some people. We wanted to create more direct and efficient feedback loops between departments. And this is actually a quote from one of the head of engineering at the bank. If we wanted to become the bank of the future, we had to break it down. So this is quite an interesting kind of statement, because feedback loops is ultimately core to Scrum, but the executive action team are there to help remove those impediments by having access to those people to be able to do it. So what is the EAT's purpose? I think I've kind of touched on this already, but ultimately it's there to remove systemic impediments across the organization. It's there to help lay the road, lay the pathway for the actual work to happen, to enable the work to continue. And this is kind of how it would look, really. We'll talk a little bit about who's in the actual executive action team shortly. But I wanted to just talk about how this works. So a team level here at the bottom, they would meet regularly, and they would have a group scrum of scrums where they kind of all meet together. Those groups of people meet, and any impediments that can't be met at the team level would then get escalated to the group level of teams. And if they can't identify or actually remove it, they would get raised again. And the benefit of all of this is that these impediments become very visible. It becomes an impediment backlog, the same way that a team have a product backlog or a sprint backlog that they need to move through. The executive action team's job then is to execute and remove those by eating the impediments, I think is how we sometimes explain it. They remove the large impediments and they communicate back down to the teams as well. And so these are the kind of ways that we would try and get that data to flow up to them and get it visible, and make sure that their backlog is very visible to everybody, so that something that's actually raised and hit to the executive action team is large enough that can't be built at a team level and can't be resolved at a team level. So what we're looking at here is somebody who is empowered to make those changes so the organization can move forward. But actually, a big key part of that is that they are making that work visible, the same way that a team would make the work visible. Often the work that hits the executive action team backlog is something that is systemic or indeed organizationally impediment. So who should be on it? Generally what we find is that the best people to be on the executive action team are empowered leaders who can make changes without asking for permission. So that needs to be relatively senior people inside an organization to do this. They can change company policy. They can write a check. They can cash some money out there. Somebody's a Scrum star, like somebody who can evangelize Scrum and Agile within the organization. Ultimately, people who can motivate change as well. Ideally, someone from HR, in case there's any requirements there around jobs, around role definitions and descriptions, and ideally someone as well from legal and compliance. These are examples of people who could be on the EAT, but what we're also finding is that you might, in your organization, may have marketing people in there, you may have some engineering leads in there, etc. But the point being is that it needs to be senior enough to help unblock those systemic organizational impediments in the organization. Okay, just moving on to how they kind of meet and how regularly they meet as well. They start off with a scrum of scrums at the team level. So each one of these hexagons on the screen is a Scrum team, and what we have is they meet regularly. So the Scrum of Scrums within Scrum at Scale is not an event. It's a set of teams that need to coordinate and is a team of teams in their own right. So we have a team of teams who are all in the same space looking to coordinate their work. There is a meeting that happens within those teams and within Scrum at Scale that's called the Scale Daily Scrum, or the SDS, which is a daily event and coordinates the Scrum of Scrum group. The idea here is that at the team level, we've bubbled up impediments, and we're bringing those Scrum teams together to remove those impediments and try and create some value. So we're trying to coordinate the teams and also remove those impediments. So the Scale Daily Scrum is where you bring those together, and what we're looking at is how we get that information then passed back up to the executive action team. So the flow of communication in a simple kind of organization here is that the SDS meets prior to the teams meeting. The input informs the teams quite often. They Scrum Masters from the Scrum of Scrums form a Scrum Master team. So they create this kind of virtual team that pull together these backlog of impediments, and they remove the blockers. Now, if they can't remove those blockers or go and find out how to remove them, then they escalate those issues up to the executive action team. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do here, is show the communication pathway all the way through up to senior leadership from a team level. And that's ultimately what the EAT sort of look like and how they get the data. One of the Scrum at Scale case studies that we talk about in training is that there is Saab managed to synchronize over 2,000 people within an hour. And this is how they kind of did it. So they met at 7:30 for the daily Scrum. Scrum of Scrums would meet at 7:45, 8 o'clock Scrum of Scrums. And then it scales up to 8:15, Scrum of Scrums. It's quite a complex, quite a very big organization. And ultimately 8:30, the executive action team. So in essence, those 2,000 people within the Griffin Saab Technologies team, hundreds of these teams managed to sync up within an hour and get these systemic impediments up through to the executive action team in a relatively quick way. And in that way, we go into a lot more detail about this during the course and stuff, but what we saw here is that two different types of plane, two different types of approach here. Waterfall was late 9 times out of 10, but the Scrum plane was a new plane, a better plane was delivered every 6 months using Scrum. And so the actual costs and the benefits outweigh it here, mainly because you could get iterative feedback and get lots of value out very quickly, but primarily because we can also remove impediments. If there are decisions to be made, they're not mired in paperwork that takes months and months and months. Potentially these very big impediments can be removed quickly in a very senior position. There is a huge area of stuff on Scrum Inc.'s website around all of these case studies. There's a Scrum Lab Prime, which has a lot of these in there. So I do recommend you have a look at this in the future and look at some of these case studies to understand these better about how this was done in great detail. And within this webinar, we haven't got a lot of time to sort of go through into the details of every single one. So I do recommend you get access to that later. So how do you get started? Well, what we'd like to say is you then identify the team that needs to be on there, really, and educate them on the purpose. So do you have the leadership available within the organization? Are they already empowered to make those changes? Are they aware of what you're trying to do as an organization? Educate them on that purpose that they have, really, and why they need to be helping to organize this. So a transformation, for example, can't just work at a team level, because you need to be able to make organizational changes. The same if you're making large scale products, which is very complex with many, many teams. If you don't have that executive action team in place, you can't enable a lot of the business agility that's needed to help those teams move as quick as they can. So having that team identified is really important. As I said before, they need to be empowered, they need to be able to make change without actually requesting permission. Also make their work visible. So as your team is working and they're making those impediments visible at a team level and maybe at a Scrum of Scrums level, these impediments sit on a backlog and they can become very visible all the way through to hit the executive action team. Now, if they can't get resolved at each one of the different areas of the business, the EAT are there to then remove it, but make that work visible. It can't just sit in a PowerPoint presentation in the back of somebody's kind of risk log. It needs to be very visible, and it needs to be seen that there's action taking place. However, the executive action team may not be the people who actually make the impact to the change. They just need to provide the permission to or source the people to do that. So sometimes the work is very visible, but they may use the Agile community of practice to help support that. They may actually fund the transformation piece of work. They may provide some of the bits and pieces to do that. Make the actions visible so that actually whatever has been decided within the EAT is visible back to the teams. That empowers the team to make sure that they also understand that the work that they're doing and the impediments they're raising are being recognised by the senior leadership, and there's actions happening. Same with a retrospective within the team. A retrospective within the team level, if actions aren't being taken at the team level, then what's the point of the retro? We want to make sure that those actions are visible and are carried out. So that's how we're doing that there, really. And then the clear communication is around making sure that the teams are seeing that work and actually coming back as well. It can be quite difficult to get this thing set up in the first place, but I think if you don't get the EAT in place before you start, then you're sub-optimizing the entire transformation, because you have teams trying to do really well, but they're getting blocked by this kind of senior leadership. And that is where coaching and support comes in. So you would coach the leadership after identifying them, you would educate them on what they need to happen, and then run some tests and experiments with them about making their work visible and making their actions visible. Now, this is a very difficult thing to do initially, mainly because what they're often hitting is brutal visibility of their work and brutal visibility of their actions. And that can be seen as quite a vulnerable position to be in. And so it requires quite courage and lots of support to be able to do that. Okay. So just to recap then, why do we need an EAT? We need an EAT to help us remove impediments which are systemic to the organization. What's their purpose? To help enable the business to be able to become better at delivering products and maybe transform. Who should be on it? Well, these people should be leaders in the organization that can make change without asking permission. How regularly do they meet? They meet very, very regularly. Depending on the organization, there is you should be meeting quite regularly, maybe 2 or 3 times a week, maybe every single day, depending on what's available. The EAT Scrum meetings, the stand-ups, etc. They may well be slightly longer than most sort of 15-minute reviews, or at least we can actually get them to start meeting and then taking those things away. What we're looking for here is a quarterly meeting or a monthly meeting of the EAT. We're looking at a much more regular kind of meeting cadence to enable that stuff to be seen. And how do you get started? Well, with all of these things, it can be very difficult, but I think the important thing here is that we start as soon as we can identify those people and help organizations see how these things can be done. So we have to educate and train and coach their leadership, understand their need for it, and then support them through that change, making their work visible, making their actions visible as well, and creating clear communication pathways. Some of the role in transformation is around the PR of the transformation itself, and making sure that the leaders are standing up to own that transformation and help support it. And maybe that's part of the work you do as a coach as well. So, questions. Alyssa, I think I've got to time just about. I think we've made up a little bit of time there. So I think we can move over to some questions if there are any.
Yes, definitely. We have quite a bit of questions to go through, but I also wanted to re-say it again. If you have any, make sure you put them in the Q&A panel below so that I can kind of cluster them and move them through. But we have a ton to start with, and this is one that I am seeing a lot. It seems like a lot of people have this top of mind. Is there a single EAT in the organization, or is it scaled from product line to business unit leadership to enterprise leadership?
Interesting. So ideally within the Scrum Scale framework, there is a single executive action team. With a very, very large organization, you may end up finding that those EATs sit within an organizational subunit, I'd imagine. So for example, if you're in a large scale bank which has if you have a large-scale bank which has, for example, very big value streams, which are, say, wealth and retail, corporate, for example, you may treat each one of those big value streams themselves as their own business units. They may have their own EAT at that level, because the EAT above that would be the executive board of the bank, and are they going to be able to remove systemic impediments within retail, wealth, etc. So I think you would look at within the structural cadence of structure of the organization to make sure that if they are able to make those empowered decisions without going to the next level up, then I would put it at that level, I thought.
Awesome. Perfect. All right. This is an interesting one. How do you handle a person of influence or an executive that is requested to be on an EAT but is resistant?
So this is quite an interesting one, because you want people on the EAT who want to be there. They need to be able to affect change. So it's kind of one of those things, you don't want to dictate that people have to be on there, but I think what you'd want to do is explain to them the benefits of that and help coach them in that direction. So for example, in your organization, there may only be a CFO, a single CFO, a single CIO, who are the people to put onto this thing. I think the idea here is to help understand and demonstrate the value that they can offer within the organization. So they'll get more visibility of the problems within the organization. They get more visibility of being able to put actions in there. So it's not just about raising their profile, it's actually about raising the value that they can offer back into the organization. So if they're super resistant, and if they don't want to be involved in it, then it would be a very difficult sell, but it's something that you can coach towards. It's something you can help with. I would always start with people who are evangelizing the actual transformation, who want to make things change. But you do have to sort of check the both sides of the same coin, because they have to be empowered to make change. So it's all well and good having an evangelist, having somebody who's a cheerleader for the transformation or the work you're doing. But if they can't affect change, then it's just another layer of feedback you need to go up through. And it increases the feedback loop and increases the efficiency of the EAT. So I think it was with some coaching and support, but I would always sort of go out to the organization first, demonstrate the value, and ask them to come back to you with who could go onto it.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that you had mentioned at the tail end how important the PR of the transformation is, and how it really brings light to a lot of the crucial actions that the EAT is taking. We had seen another question that basically said, at my organization, it's hard to explain or show senior leadership how crucial their involvement is. In your policy change example, what was the initial reaction? Did you see kind of, heads turn a little bit in the EAT specifically? Yeah,
so when we asked for that policy change to be made, in that particular example, the virtualization example, there were many, many others around this kind of thing. But when we saw that change happen relatively quickly, albeit an experimental change initially to prove that it was okay. So they didn't just make a broad stroke change to the whole organization without considering the impact. We saw the kind of the EAT were like, oh, well, of course we'll try it. Why shouldn't we try it? Because what we could also demonstrate is not just the impediment, but the impact of that impediment. And that's the key thing. When you're actually raising an impediment, it's just not like, well, Joe can't log into his machine today, so that's an impediment. Raise it all the way up to the CIO. It's like, well, there must be a reason behind it. There's an impact to this impediment, and there must be a reason for it. So there would always be normal pathways to resolve these issues. But it's when you hit those layers of permafrost you can't get through, which are not necessarily managerial, but could be policy change. And so at the team level, we saw that huge impact. They're like, so that actually got changed, so we can use that now. Well, that's cool. But very cleverly, the CIO we were working with wanted to demonstrate the value of that change and that policy change in the release show and tell for the whole program. So he asked them to get on stage and demonstrate that value, so that when we had 200 people in a room looking at this stuff, they were like, wow, so that can be changed. And he was like, yeah, I can change that, and raising impediments so we can get this stuff done. So the impact of that was important, but I think the savvy thing was the PR of that impact as well. So raising that, if this is blocking, this is the impact of it, but also if we fix it, we want to make sure we shout and tell everybody about it. So it was really important, I think.
Awesome. Perfect. All right. You said that the escalation of an impediment relies on the Scrum Master. What do you do if there are disagreements about impediments that should be escalated? For example, the team thinks an issue should be raised, but the Scrum Master or multiple Scrum Masters don't.
So I only managed to touch on it very briefly. We do talk a huge amount more about this on the training, but what we talk about here is that the people closest to the problem bring it to the impediment. So although the Scrum Masters do meet as part of that Scrum Master team, it doesn't mean that it's just Scrum Masters. If a developer's got a very specific problem that can articulate the impediment very clearly, then the Scrum Masters are there to help communicate that issue all the way through to whoever can get it fixed. And so it's important that you bring the right people with the information to it. I think the important here is that you don't want Scrum Masters to become, in effect, another layer to get through. What their job there is to do is to allow for the collaboration and the visibility of the impediments. And so it's more of, if my team here have this problem with a particular dev server or test server, and your team has the same problem and your team has the same problem, okay, let's look at how we raise that up. If I've got the problem with the test server and you don't, but do you know how we can help resolve it at this level? Yeah, we'll talk to Jeff over there. He can come and help us with this test server and we'll work about it. So they are working impediments. They were at a team level, but just the next level up. So there would be shared team of team learnings there. And so I think the idea here is, rather than seeing the Scrum Masters as managers, which kind of then can veto whether or not something goes up through the impediment backlog, because what you're trying to do is make things very visible and very clear to everybody, is that there has to be real reason for that. And if you don't have a reason for the impediment, there's no impact to it, and it's not impacting more than 1 or 2 people, then there are probably other routes to get those resolved rather than the AT.
Perfect. All right, another one. What happens if my EAT is distributed, or members of the EAT are distributed? How do I have a visible backlog?
So a visible backlog could be used using technology, of course. So a visible backlog doesn't have to be a whiteboard with blue tape and post-its, although I'd always advocate having very visible work in the workplace if possible. So if you have a particular tool that you're using to help visualize the work, whether that be a Trello or a Jira or a Rally or whatever it is now, these called Agile Central, there are ways to make those virtual backlogs visible to everybody. And quite often in your scaled organization, you will have some sort of digital backlog. We're talking about having those impediments visible on those. So it doesn't just disappear into a deck somewhere that somebody is looking at. It's a visible thing. I'm a developer at the team level. I want to see what the CIO's backlog is. And one of the big things here is about brutal transparency and brutal visibility. And actually that impediment's been sat in the backlog for 3 months. Why hasn't it been actioned? And so, you can, because it's visible, you can make it kind of actionable as well and hold people to account. What we don't want to see is things in the backlog that stay there forever and eventually just drop off the end because no one's talking about it. By making it visible, we can see it. So yeah, distributed teams, obviously it's a modern world challenge. If your EAT is distributed, still regularly meeting is important. But I would suggest meeting similar to this with a Zoom, making sure that you've got a video conferencing, see the whites of their eyes, and meet regularly to discuss these things. And then making sure that the visible backlog is something that they can all see at the same time using whatever tools are available.
Awesome. Perfect. All right. An additional one, can you elaborate just a little bit on the appropriate cadence for the EAT to meet?
Sure. So it really does look at the context of the organization, and what we're looking at within the organization is sometimes the EAT can meet daily, depending on where they're located and what they're doing. What we want to make sure is they're meeting at least a few times a week to help sort of get that visibility and reduce that feedback loop. Now, bearing in mind that there may well not be anything that's of value to them, the same way that there may not be any impediments at the team level for their daily stand-up. However, what we often wanted to see is progress on the actual issues that are there. And it might take a longer time though. So one of the things I have seen is that some of these issues can take a while to actually get through at the EAT level because they're larger issues. There are systemic issues across the organization. So if you want a policy change, you may not have a CIO that's empowered to make that change without doing a lot of groundwork beforehand. You may have a lot more kind of procurement processes to go through. So these things might change, might take a long time to do it, but making sure it's visible is important. But similarly, if you have a Scrum team working and they don't see the value of meeting every single day, we'll meet once a week, then all you're really doing is you're delaying that feedback loop for their plan and for their reviews of work. So I would suggest that there is no kind of hard and fast rules for the EAT to sort of meet and sync up, but it's as appropriate. So if you're in a very large organization, the EAT may only meet monthly, but you take that hit of the reduced feedback loop and the longer time cycle to do it. And maybe a weekly meeting would be better with these teams. So it's a bit of a suck it and see. And unfortunately, it's not a clear-cut answer. And if that kind of leads me on to something else, really. So the Scrum Scale framework is a framework. It's not prescriptive in that manner. You work within the framework, you work within the structure you have. There are some guidance and there's some knowledge about what you can do around each of these things that we do talk about quite a bit in the trainings and the simulations we do. But the idea here is that when you adopt things, it is scaffolding to start with, that it will help you move to the next layer. And actually, you may find that monthly is enough for your organization, depending on what your products are that you're delivering. Within Saab, they were doing it daily. And the reason they're doing it daily is because they had a very complex, very difficult machine that they were building with very different parts all the way through it. And by having that regular sync up, they were able to sort of reduce and remove impediments from weapon systems to guidance systems to the materials being used, to the paint being used, to the ejector seats, anything. And so there was a huge amount of impediments all the time that they needed to reduce and review.
Awesome. Perfect. All right. Well, we have a couple of more generic questions, but I do want to respect the time box and kind of wrap things up, if that's okay with you, John.
Sure.
Cool. Perfect. Yeah, I want to thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who put your questions in the Q&A panel, engaged. This was an awesome presentation. We've seen quite a few webinars recently on the product owner, so I was very excited when you wanted to talk about the executive action team. I think it's a super interesting topic, and one that we haven't had a lot of content around. Just a few things that I wanted to mention before I send it over to you. You did mention the practitioner courses or the trainings, the Scrum at Scale trainings, and this is just a reminder that all of those are going to be featured on the Scrum at Scale website. I know John has a couple of classes coming up that he might touch on, but in general, they're found under the Find a Course on the website. And it will basically take, this is just a brief overview, it will take a lot of these components and deep dive into them. And also, this is the third webinar that we have done this week. All three of them will be available on the YouTube channel with a recap with the slides by tomorrow morning. So if you're interested, definitely go and check those guys out. And I will hand it over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. And thank you for inviting me to do this as well. It's good to be involved in these type of things in the wider community. Yeah, the Scrum Scale practitioner courses do run regularly. We do one every few months. We've got one running the 28th and 29th of November in London in the UK. By all means, take a picture or some details from my website there, agilecenter.com, but you can actually also find it on the Scrum Scale website as well. We'll be running a discount code for people who've been on the webinar, so by all means get in touch and we can send that on to you. And the course itself is a 2-day interactive course, so we kind of learn a lot through play and interactions, and we build a really cool heat map to basically give you an opportunity across the 2 days to understand and build out your actual scaling backlog as part of it. So there's always not just a tell as part of the training. We want to have clear value that you get out as an outcome from the training. So you have this kind of wall of improvement that you can take away and start executing straight away in organizations. So it's very valuable. We find it very helpful for organizations as well, and hope to see you at the next sort of training session.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, thank you so much again, John, and thank you for everyone that joined us today. See you next time.
Thank you. Take care now.
All right. Bye.